Hey guys, welcome back to A Chapter a Day, taking you through my journey of discovery through my African eyes. By the way, the book is available all or across the capital, Nairobi, in bookshops everywhere. I recommend you go to Prestige Bookshop. Ask for Ahmed. He'll hook you up. He'll even deliver to you. Those of you who have bought the book, I appreciate it. Thanks so much. Those of you who have enjoyed it, thank you for your feedback. And those joining us for the very first time, I'm taking you through my journey. So, in the first part, we talked about how I discovered my gift in journalism, gift of telling stories. How I worked for Pan Am, got into that, left Pan Am, ended up in New York, went to college there. I first attended a 2-year college called Kingsborough Community College. I ended up being the valedictorian. From there, I got a scholarship to New York University, one of the most prestigious universities in America. And I went on to study broadcast journalism. Now in NYU, New York University, you can get a job just about anywhere. And I ended up working for the big broadcasters in America. First ABC News, later NBC News. Now, it was at NBC News. And by that time, I was already married to my first wife, Sonia, an amazing woman, fantastic. I was living the American dream. Never thought of coming back to Kenya at all. Kenya was the last thing on my mind. But it was while working at NBC News that I saw 2 stories that changed my mind completely and made me want to come to Africa. In 1994, if you go back, 2 incidents 2 months apart changed my complete perspective. One was an incident popularly known as Black Hawk Down, when 19 elite US Army Rangers and Delta Force was slaughtered in the streets of Mogadishu, Somalia by bandits. And some of the bodies dragged through the streets. It was a huge story in America. I was working for NBC News then. Huge story. But for me, it was a story being told from the American perspective. It wasn't about the fighting in Somalia. It wasn't about the locals. It was just 19 elite soldiers killed in the streets. And I said to myself, what about the other side? That was story number 1. Story number 2, around the same time, a couple of months later, the entire world had gathered in Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, to inaugurate the country's first ever black president. Former prisoner turned president Nelson Mandela had just won the multi-party elections and was being inaugurated as the president. The entire world had focused its coverage on that. And yet, a few hundred kilometers away, in a tiny little known country called Rwanda, which very few people could pinpoint on a map, a genocide was taking part, where more than 10,000 people were being killed every single day for 100 days. Do the math. That's about 1 million people in 100 days. It was incredible. And I kept saying to myself, my goodness, why isn't that story being told? How come no one's bothering about a genocide taking place in the 20th century? Right there and then I decided, you know what? This is it for me. America, it's time to leave. If you want to tell your story, you have to be there on the ground yourself to do the story. So I did some research and I found out that the famous photojournalist Mohamed Moamin was in Kenya, was running a show called Africa Journal, working for Reuters news agency. And I wrote to him. Those days it was fax. It wasn't email. It wasn't WhatsApp. It was fax. You sent him a fax. And I got his number. I sent him a fax. I said, look, I've been in America nearly 10 years. I want to come back home. What do I do? Can I get a job with you? And we spoke several times. And in the end, he said, listen, Jeff, pack up, come home. There'll always be something for you. And I did that. To cut a long story short, packed up, left America, came back home, and I started working for Reuters news agency and that program, Africa Journal, which was very famous for a long time. And I worked with Reuters for 3 years, from 95 to 98 in Nairobi. And then they decided to send me, relocate me to Abidjan. in West Africa, in Ivory Coast, a country called Ivory Coast, La Côte d'Ivoire, they called it. Packed up, went over, and started reporting as the senior producer in all of West Africa. Now, here's where we pick it up at chapter 8. The chapter is called The Perils of Telling a Story. And we had been in Abidjan about 2 months when I got my first major assignment. It was January 6th, 1999, the day before my 30th birthday. We got word from our Sierra Leone stringer, Aliou Camara, that there was gunfire in the streets of Freetown. He told us he had seen lots of roadblocks being manned by child soldiers and tires being set on fire. My obvious call right then was to call London, quickly tell them the story, and try and get the go-ahead. My cameraman then, an Ivory Coast guy called Clotaire Achi, and I headed to the airport after we got a green light to find out that all flights to Freetown had been cancelled. The only option was to try and get a charter. We finally convinced a flight crew for $10,000, courtesy of Reuters, to fly us in. 2.5 hours later, we landed at Lungi Airport, located on an estuary on the outskirts of Freetown. Anyone who has flown into Lungi knows that the only way to get into Freetown is either a 7-minute helicopter ride or an hour's ferry ride. As we were landing, a fleet of United Nations helicopters was approaching from the city. Not a good sign. I told Clotaire. We quickly got our gear and started filming the helicopters. As they landed, out jumped Dr. David Okello. Now, he was the UN's top man in Sierra Leone. I quickly ran to him, surrounded by a phalanx of bodyguards. We identified ourselves and I asked him for a comment. He said, quote, "Freetown is not safe anymore. We have to evacuate all our staff." We finished the interview, and as Dr. Okello turned to walk towards his aircraft, taking off, he looked back and said, "Jeff, be careful. It is ugly out there." I nodded, and we continued to film as he entered the awaiting UN plane before it took off for neighboring Guinea. Meanwhile, we tried to see if we could get into the city, but there were no helicopter flights available. We were stuck in no man's land with the biggest story of the day right at our fingertips. Just as we were contemplating what to do for the night, another chartered plane landed as the sun was setting. Out jumped our competition. With Reuters television, we had our competition. We had two, actually. It was WTN and there was APTN, Associated Press Television. In this case, it was APTN, made up of Myles Tierney, award-winning photographer David Gutenfelder, and their West African bureau chief Ian Stewart. We were already outnumbered 3-1, but that is the way we liked it. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. It was always like that in the field. We were like competitors, but we also knew that survival in a hostile environment meant safety in numbers. Now, Myles was an American cameraman based out of Nairobi. I knew him very well. I had been in the field with him several times, and to me, he was fearless, he was gung-ho. He was also as tough as nails and never complained about an assignment or the environment. Ian Stewart was the agency's bureau chief based in Abidjan, a Canadian by birth and on his first overseas assignment. David Gutenfelder was an American, one of APTN's most celebrated photojournalists, whose award-winning photographs often appeared on the front pages of leading newspapers around the world. Now, all three posed a formidable challenge, but I thought to myself, at least we were not alone, and this story was already beginning to look like it would be around for a while, which meant plenty of exclusives to go around. Now, we spent the night at a nearby guest house in Lungi, awaiting to get into Freetown the following morning. As soon as we were settled in, Clotaire, my cameraman, and I set about transmitting the pictures and the interview we had earlier on with Dr. David Okello. We knew we had to keep this story going, and the only way we could do this was by getting our pictures out in the hope that they would be on the air that same evening on all major global networks. Now, the next day was my 30th birthday, and we spent most of it at Lungi Airport trying to convince anyone with a helicopter to get us into Freetown. It was tough going. No one was willing to take the risk. There was one government helicopter ferrying mercenaries and ammunition from the capital into the country's interior. The South African mercenary pilots were too busy to accommodate us. We also found out that the one ferry available had broken down, and only one fisherman with a canoe was willing to take us in. We decided it would be too dangerous with all the sensitive transmission equipment and cameras that we were carrying. In the end, we returned to the guest house, tired and frustrated. I had bought a couple of bottles of wine in Abidjan, and we toasted my birthday later on that evening. The next day, there were still no flights, even as we saw in the distance that Freetown was still burning. Thick clouds of black smoke billowed in the air, and we could hear the distant sound of mortar fire. We would later learn that the rebels had stormed Freetown in the days before, and in a scorched earth policy, were literally setting the capital on fire, street by street. Many of the buildings were ablaze. Churches, mosques, schools, and even the massive UN regional headquarters, all were on fire. Now, the airport terminal at Lungi was completely empty, as no one dared venture outdoors for fear of the rebels. We lounged around waiting and hoping for a break. Meanwhile, Myles and Ian found a couple of wheelchairs used to carry elderly passengers or those with disabilities. Now, in the boredom and anxiety, they were playing what we call bumper cars in the empty lounge. It looked pretty harmless at the time, just a couple of bored guys killing time. Clotaire, my cameraman, ever the superstitious one, turned to me, and in his thick French accent, he said, "In my tribe, people who aren't disabled don't do this. These guys are mocking God." I didn't think much of it at the time. Finally, late on January the 9th, 3 days after we had landed, we got a ride into the city courtesy of the same South African mercenaries. After sitting at Lungi Airport for 3 days, it took us less than 10 minutes to get into the capital. We landed at the Mama Yoko helipad, where luckily we found some drivers willing to take us around for a handsome fee. We headed straight to the nearby Cape Sierra Hotel, and once checked in, started inquiring as to what was the latest. Luck was on our side. Julius Spencer, the country's Minister for Information, heard that some international journalists had landed, and he drove to see us in a heavily armed convoy. We sat at the bar with him, and over a few beers, he explained the situation. The Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, had infiltrated the city and was involved in a heavy exchange of gunfire with government forces. There were lots of casualties, he explained, but the government had pushed the RUF to the outskirts of the city. We told him we wanted to do our assessment of the city the next day and filmed what we could. He insisted it was dangerous, but after pleading, he agreed to arrange for military escort of West African peacekeepers. We said we would be more comfortable if he rode alongside us, and he agreed. This would be the first time we would witness what was really going on in Sierra Leone. For clearance, we called our respective headquarters and explained our plans. We got the green light to go in on condition the peacekeepers were also involved. January 10th, 1999 was a glorious day. The sky was a deep blue, and the sun had already warmed the streets below as the military convoy arrived on time as promised. Among the occupants, and dressed in full military fatigues, was Information Minister Julius Spencer. "Are you guys ready?" he said. "Yes, sir. Let's do this," said Myles. And off we went. Freetown now is a relatively small city with a population of about 500,000. The entire country is made up of about 4 million people, but at the time, tens of thousands had been displaced due to the ongoing civil war. Getting around the empty streets was therefore easy. 10 minutes into the ride, we asked to stop and film the scenes before us. The peacekeepers spread out in formation, and we started working. Littering the streets were the bodies of dead Sierra Leoneans, bloated and in grotesque conditions. Street after street, we witnessed the same scenes. Bodies of men, women, children lay where they had been shot. The smell of decaying human flesh was overwhelming. One dog picked at a trash can and came away with a human hand from elbow to fingers. Once in a while, we came across a checkpoint manned by very young soldiers. I remember remarking about how young and innocent they appeared. "Child soldiers," said one of the peacekeepers. The rebels used them as their first line of defense. I was curious. "Aren't you guys afraid that they'll shoot you?" I asked the peacekeepers. This is what they said. "We are the men. They are merely boys. Even in war," they said, "they have to respect that." After about 2 hours of filming, I decided I would head back to the hotel and transmit the incredible images back to Reuters offices in London. I told my cameraman Clotaire to proceed with the convoy, and I would find my way back to the hotel. Our competition, the APTN crew, saw me get out of the car, and instead of one of them accompanying me, they decided to carry on with the convoy and see what more footage they would get. I walked back to the hotel 3 kilometers, braving the persistent stench of death everywhere. After the first kilometer, I stopped, gagging. Numbness had set in, and I just kept walking. Finally got to the hotel, and once there, I began transmitting the pictures through the live wire satellite phone equipment. I was feeling pretty happy with my decision. These pictures will be used by every broadcaster by this evening, I said to myself. This is exclusive stuff, I thought, as I lay on my bed waiting for Clotaire to return with the rest of the day's filming. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door. Jeff, c'est Clotaire. Myles est mort. Myles is dead, he repeated. I swung open the door and saw Clotaire's white t-shirt covered in blood. Qu'est-ce qui se passe, mon frère? What the hell happened? I asked. Clotaire was choking back tears as he recounted what had happened shortly after I had left filming in the streets. They were driving down one of the streets and came upon a checkpoint manned by child soldiers. They let the peacekeepers pass without incident and then suddenly opened fire on the vehicle carrying Myles, Ian, and David, the entire APTN crew. Clotaire was in the car behind them and saw the whole thing unfolding. He was lucky that his driver suddenly braked and reversed the car and fast got out of there. After a safe distance, the driver stopped. No one spoke. Then a vehicle full of peacekeepers appeared and the soldiers assured Clotaire that everything was all right. In retaliation, the peacekeepers had killed all the child soldiers at the checkpoint. Clotaire asked about the APTN crew and was told that one of them, Myles, had been killed on the spot. Another casualty turned out to be Ian, the bureau chief, who had sustained bullet wounds to his head, but was still alive. The third, David, the photographer, had miraculously escaped by jumping out of the window of the moving car. Somehow, Clotaire had managed and gathered the strength to return to the scene of the incident, where he filmed the bullet-riddled car with Myles still slouched in the back seat, blood all over his head and face. He had been shot 6 times at close range with an AK-47. Clotaire then asked the peacekeepers to help pull out his dead colleague and take him to a nearby military morgue to avoid the swarming vultures. They put Myles in one of the military vehicles and Clotaire raced back to the hotel to tell me the news. I immediately got on the phone and called our bureau chief, West African bureau chief Nick Fithian, who hooked up a conference call with London. I explained what had happened, saying Myles was lying in one of the makeshift morgues controlled by the peacekeeping forces, and Ian was in critical condition and needed urgent medical attention. London insisted we do not broadcast the news about Myles until his family had been notified. APTN in London was immediately informed, and they set about arranging for a charter plane to fly out and pick up Ian and Myles's body. In the meantime, Clotaire and I went to check on Ian. We found him at the poorly equipped military camp, lying on the floor on a stretcher with just a drip attached to his arm. David, the photographer who had escaped within an inch of his life, was also there, trying to comfort a now delirious Ian. We could see where the bullet had entered Ian's head and lodged between his temple. The one thing I vividly remember is Ian muttering as he lapsed in and out of consciousness. It was a frightening and horrifying scene. There were no doctors, no nurses, no equipment. What must have been going through his mind, I wondered. Was he wishing he were dead? Did he ever imagine he would end up like this in the middle of an African civil war? It is safe to say Ian would have died on that stretcher had the charter plane sent in by APTN not arrived in time. Later in the day, we got word that the charter plane had landed at Lungi, and luckily the peacekeepers had a helicopter available to fly the dead and injured out. We covered Myles in a bedsheet and laid him on the helicopter while Ian and David sat next to him. Clotaire and I contemplated going with them, but there was not enough room on the helicopter for all of us. As it took off, we could see thick smoke billowing from the streets beyond. Freetown was burning, and one of the teams set out to tell the story had been silenced. We were the only international team of journalists left to carry on the story, and for Myles's sake, we felt we had no choice but to stay on. Clotaire and I, as you can imagine, were scared to death. What happened to Myles could have happened to any of us in the coming days, but that is not what we were thinking about. We figured we owed it to a brave and fearless journalist who had paid the ultimate price for trying to tell the African story. Later that night, after the plane with Myles's body and the other two had taken off, a call came through from London, and the message was short and clear. Stay in your rooms, do not venture out, no matter what, until further notice. Now, it was not the message we were wanted to hear, but the decision had been made. That night, believe it or not, I got down on my knees, and for the first time in many weeks, I prayed. I prayed for Myles, I prayed for Ian, and for our continued safety in this wicked and unforgiving place. I prayed that if this was where I was going to end my journalism career, then so be it. But if we could get out of this madness alive, I would try to be a better journalist and a better human being. Now, after what seemed like a pretty long request to the Almighty, I lay down on my bed, and for some reason, I could not erase Myles's image from my mind, sitting there in the back of the car, half his head blown away, but still clutching onto his camera. I kept wondering to myself what was going through his mind those very last few minutes as the convoy passed the checkpoint and the child soldiers suddenly opened fire. Now, the next morning, Clotaire was the first one up. Actually, like me, he had hardly slept all night. He too had nightmares of Myles in the back of the car and Ian Stewart on the stretcher screaming. He knocked on my door and told me we would meet in the dining room. I joined him 15 minutes later and found him chatting with the waiters and chefs in the empty room. They all wore that look of sadness and dismay. They all liked and admired Myles. It is so sad that someone who was here to tell the world our story has been killed by it, said our driver Sharif. What are we doing to ourselves? No one, he said, is safe anymore. Now smoke continued to billow in the skies. Thick, dark plumes of acrid smoke drifted into the clear blue skies as we sat by the bar overlooking the powerful waves of the Atlantic Ocean crashing onto the beach. The beach itself was littered with the dead bodies of Sierra Leoneans. Clotaire and I kept going over what we could have done differently the day before. It is always so painful when one keeps saying, I wish we had done this, or I wish we had returned to the hotel earlier to file our stories. But as always, hindsight is 2020. We had to somehow pick up the pieces and move on. And by the look of things, we had only two choices. Either tell Reuters we wanted out, and they would have flown a charter plane to pick us up, or sort it out, continue telling the African story, if anything, for Myles' sake. Now, letting the story die with the messenger would have made both our trip fruitless and futile. We agreed that we owed it to Myles. That evening, we had a conference call with Abidjan and London, and it was only after we had assured our bosses that we would remain within reasonable distance of the hotel and call in every 4 hours that we were allowed to continue filming and getting whatever story we could. As we hung up, we realized what we had committed ourselves to, but we also knew deep down inside that this is what we were born to do. The next day, we were out and driving the streets of Freetown. We had only been 15 minutes into the streets when we came upon what can only be described as a scene from hell. Hundreds of vultures were feasting on carcasses. It was the most horrific sight I'd ever seen in my life. To top it all, the silence was deafening. It seemed like either everyone had fled Freetown or they were all hiding in their homes, too scared to come out. And who could blame them? We were compelled to get out of the car and Clotaire began filming. I whipped out my notebook and frantically scribbled notes, recording what I was seeing. The world has to see this, I told Clotaire. We have a duty to tell the world. We moved from area to area, always watchful of checkpoints, alert for what we would later learn was the notorious Small Boys Unit, or SBU, who were busy terrorizing the residents and looting, burning everything in sight. I could not believe the amount of destruction. Who was going to clean up the streets, I kept wondering. How long will it take to rebuild this once beautiful capital city? Did these crazy children realize what they were doing? We eventually got to the center of town where an old fig tree, said to be more than 300 years old, still stood. This is where the so-called freed slaves from British colonies decided to make their new city. It is said that the city grew around the fig tree. 3 centuries later, we stood at the same spot, watching the place that they had built more than 300 years earlier self-destruct. Vultures lounged around lazily on the branches of the fig tree, surveying their prey. Now, the number of decomposing bodies was astonishing. Once in a while, the vultures would swoop down, tear off a human arm or a bunch of intestines, then make their way up the tree to devour it. Clotaire captured it all on tape while I wrote down what I saw. We would then rush back to the hotel to send the story by email through the sat phone to the Reuters bureau in Abidjan. What I didn't realize was that the stories I was filming from the field were quickly making their way to newspapers around the world. Most newspapers subscribed to Reuters, And after Myles's and Ian's story became public, no one was willing to send anyone to cover the madness that had become Sierra Leone. Clotaire and I decided to establish a simple daily routine. Every morning, we left the Cape Sierra Hotel in search of a different angle to tell the story, and we returned in the evening to file our stories. It was necessary to drive this story in such a way that those reading or watching on television would feel that there was an end to it, whether good, bad, or ugly. We owned this story, and we owed it to ourselves to tell it right. Now, on one of the long days, we decided to visit Connaught Hospital, Freetown's only functioning health facility. It seemed to be the place with the most activity at the time. Now, arriving a little after 9 a.m., as we were assembling our equipment, a truck drove up to the main entrance of the hospital. The driver jumped out and went to the backside to open the latch. Out jumped about a dozen men, women, and children, most with crude and bloody bandages on their arms and legs. As usual, Clotaire was already filming as we followed them into the hospital's dark and dank corridors. They were quickly ushered into a room where a nurse was busy attending to other victims. The air was filled with the smell of death, blood, and antiseptic. As soon as the nurse finished dressing the wounds, she came over and began removing the crude bandages from one of the victims who had just come in. He was telling us we were attacked last night in Sumter, a small town on the way to the airport. They demanded to know who we are. Then they gave us two choices, either short sleeves or long sleeves. We thought they were giving us clothes. I chose long sleeves, he said. Clotaire and I later learned that short sleeves meant chopping the hand off at the elbow, and long sleeves chopping the hand off at the wrist. It was unthinkable that human beings could commit such savagery on their fellow human beings. I shuddered at the thought of how many blows it took from an axe or a machete to slice through human bone. It made me sick to my stomach. By this time, the nurse had undone the bandages, and to our horror, the man's arm from wrist downwards fell to the floor with a thud. Instinctively, Clotaire panned his camera down to show the severed arm on the floor. I clearly remembered that the watch on the man's wrist read 9:23 a.m. The man, still in shock, could only say, "Thank God I'm still alive. There are many who didn't make it." We were stunned into silence. At the same time, the nurse injected the man with a painkiller before dressing the wound. I remember asking her how she could do this and remain detached. "Do you know how many of these cases I see every day?" she told me. "More than 30. Sometimes it is one hand, sometimes it is both, other times the legs." Now, up until this point, I had never imagined or seen such brutality. The Civil War was now completely out of control, and if nothing was done soon, the entire nation would be reduced to a population of armless and legless citizens. The nurse continued, "What about those who weren't able to get to hospital? That's why this man feels he's one of the lucky ones, that he's still alive." The same man got up to leave and even thanked the nurse. By this time, she was taking the fallen arm and, before our cameras, very casually tossed it out of the window. I looked at Clotaire, who literally followed the arm with his camera. I made a note to myself, follow the arm's destination once we're done in here. Next in line was a man with both arms completely wrapped in crude bandages. I feared for the worst, and my fears were confirmed a short time later. Both the man's arms had been hacked off, and as the bandages were removed, I could see them dangling by a piece of skin. Once again, The nurse had no choice but to grab her scissors and snip away at the skin, letting the arm fall to the ground. She did the same with the second arm. Once again, she administered a quick injection for the pain as the man screamed that he was only a businessman and did not support any political party. I was already numb with shock. Now, while we had previously filmed and written about dead bodies, vultures, child soldiers, we now had victims who were recounting what had happened to them and wondering about their future. 3 more victims later, Clotaire and I had to get out to get some fresh air. But remember, we still had to follow the arms and see where had been tossed out the window. We walked to the back of the hospital only to be met by a pack of dogs busy carting away an arm here, a leg there, limbs piled up outside the window. Clotaire filmed as I took notes. Never had I seen so many limbs piled together. It looked like an orthopedic factory where various limbs were dumped in a corner for disposal. Only this time, these were real human arms and legs. By the time we filed our story that day, we could not even think of dinner. Those poor people whose lives had been destroyed because of the selfish greed of a few were now left to fend for themselves, without arms or legs. I could not take these thoughts out of my mind as I lay on my bed that night. What did they do to deserve this? What kind of evil had taken over this once beautiful, peaceful nation? And why? For what? Diamonds? Multi-party politics? Or just plain hate? It was surreal in many ways, especially having that front row seat watching history unfolding. It was scary, it was unnerving, and it was haunting. But in a way, I was glad we had not abandoned this story, or indeed the people of Sierra Leone. Fast forward, on our 26th day on the ground, we were going about our usual patrolling of the streets, filming whatever we could, and we heard that the RUF had attacked the port and were fighting with government troops. For the very first time, Clotaire, my cameraman, turned to me and said, "Mon frère," he had a very heavy French accent, "Mon frère, this looks bad. Maybe it's time to leave the country and this story." I turned to him, half expecting that he was joking, but I saw the seriousness in his face, and I said, "You know what? Maybe you're right. Let's make this our last story, and let's get out of here." And that's exactly what we did. We filmed the scenes of the port's bodies again lying everywhere, interviewing the peacekeepers, filed our story for the night. And as we filed our story, I called London and I said, "You know what, guys? We've been here close to a month. Maybe it's time for us to leave." And immediately, without any argument, London said, That's cool, boys. Pack up. Go back home." And that's what we did. 26 days later, we got a helicopter ride out of Freetown, got to Lungi airport. Fortunately, there was a charter flight, a military flight. They were flying to Guinea-Conakry. After that, they were heading to Abidjan. We convinced them to get on that flight. And I tell you, there's no better feeling. Bittersweet. Leaving the story behind, because it was nowhere near over, but heading home to some sanity after more than 3 weeks of madness. Freetown and Sierra Leone finally disappeared below us, but I could not help feeling concerned for the people we had left behind. What brutality, sadness, hopelessness. No wonder the world refers to us Africans as savages. Who could blame them? Look at what we do to each other. Up to that point, I had never seen anything so horrific in my years as a journalist. Little did I know that this was only the beginning. Right next door in Liberia, another civil war had been raging. This one would eventually see the slaughter of more than 250,000 innocent civilians before a sense of sanity was restored. There was no better feeling than landing at Houphouët-Boigny Airport in Abidjan that day. I tell you, it was like landing in civilization. After more than 3 weeks of madness, we landed in a place of sanity. And I said to myself, I will never complain again. But the work was still undone. The civil war in Sierra Leone would go on for the next 2 years and would cost countless lives, including more of our colleagues in the field. Fast forward, May 24th, 2000, long after I had left West Africa, Clotaire, my cameraman, returned to Sierra Leone with a new team sent in from London. He was accompanied by veteran correspondent Kurt Schork, photographer Yanis Barakas, and seasoned war cameraman Mark Chisholm. On that day, just like I did a year before, Clotaire stayed back in his hotel. The rest of the crew went out to film the remnants of a battle between the West African peacekeepers, ECOMOG, and rebels. Similar to what happened during our time, they were accompanied by veteran cameraman Miguel Moreno from APTN. Now, they drove in 2 separate vehicles and got to a place called Rockberry Junction, where the locals said they weren't going to go beyond that. They refused. So what did the crews do? They got into the vehicles and started driving themselves. Drove past Rockberry Junction, about an hour's ride from Freetown, and there they could hear gunshots. As they were driving down the road, the gunshots became more and louder, and they decided, you know what, either we turn back or we go straight. And they decided to drive straight, and they drove straight into an ambush. The rebels shot at the 2 vehicles, literally killing both drivers on sight. The other folks literally jumped out of the windows and ran into the bush. Mark and Yanis managed to escape, but Kurt and Moreno, both of them were killed on the spot. Again, just like a year ago, again in a foreign land. It was incredible to see these images. Why do people go and cover stories that are so dangerous? Foreigners in a foreign land covering a story like that. I always wondered to myself, why do we drive ourselves to do these stories? But you know what? This business is more like a calling. You don't force yourself to do it. You just do it because you want to from the bottom of your heart. And I told myself, if anyone's going to tell the African story, I will do it. The good, the bad, the ugly. Whether it's disease, death, despair, you name it, I would film it. And also, the good stories, good news stories as well. Yes, there is doom and gloom on one side, but there is hope, eternal hope on the other side. And I would try and bring both of these together to show the new Africa. Join me as I continue to tell my journey of discoveries across the African continent in the next episode of A Chapter a Day. Right here, through my African eyes.